to record. So welcome everybody to the second session of the House Divided book study. I'm Steve Baska. I'm your Zoom host and moderator tonight, and our leader will be Reverend Jerry Butler, our pastor of discipleship. Rev Mark Feldmeyer is not with us tonight, but he is going to drop in on some of these Tuesday night classes when his schedule allows. Want to have a few announcements before we get started. First one is we are recording this session, as we are trying to record each session because people would like to be here live and can't sometimes. So we want to make this available for replay and for sharing with other folks. So please be aware that this is being recorded and will be on the internet available. Second announcement is please mute yourself. In the lower left corner of your screen is a little icon that says mute and looks like a microphone. And please mute yourself so we don't hear background noise. If I need to, I can do that from my Zoom controls, and I will listen for any excessive background noise and take care of that. Third thing is please be kind when you make comments tonight. We are discussing social issues that can be divisive and emotional, and so please be kind to our speaker and to each other. If anybody gets carried away, I also have the power to mute any speakers that may get carried away in that also.
There you go.
Also, we are going to utilize the raise hand function on Zoom tonight. When you want to ask a question, click on a button on the lower center of your screen called Reactions. So look in the lower center or right section of the screen where it says Reactions and click on that and then click on the hand. So it will look like a hand that goes up on your screen and Jerry can see that and call on you that way. If you can't find that, go ahead and ask your question anyway, but that will be a way to help us be more organized. Okay, with that, I think that's our announcements, and I'm going to read our opening prayer and our closing prayer later, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jerry. So we are, if you have your book and you want to follow along the opening prayer, it's on page 30. We are in chapter 2 tonight of the book, chapter on racism, and I'll do the prayer. God of justice, in your wisdom, you create all people in your image, without exception. Through your goodness, open our eyes to see the dignity, beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are brothers and sisters in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent of racist attitudes, behaviors, and speech that demean others. Open our ears to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history, and fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, build bridges, forgive and be forgiven, and to establish peace and equality for all in our communities. Amen. Okay, thank you for joining us, everyone. I want to introduce Pastor Jerry Butler, who began in July at St. Andrew as our pastor of discipleship, in addition to other duties such as preaching, as you heard Jerry do. And he also leads a class that's starting shortly this fall on the 5 vital practices of the Christian faith. So you can email Jerry directly at the church to get on that class and get those Zoom links. And I would encourage you to do that too. So with that, Jerry, thanks for being our leader tonight.
You bet. First, again, thank you everyone for being here, for being willing to listen to this discussion. I do kind of want to lay out a roadmap of where we're going to go tonight. I'm going to do my very best to try to keep us down to about an hour and 15 minutes. And so with that in mind, I'm going to need your help. I know that this discussion is front and center in a lot of people's minds and Facebook feeds. and can drive a lot of comments and a lot of opinions and extended discussion. But what I really want to do tonight is kind of focus on the book itself and the material that's in this chapter, and really kind of pray that it would spur your curiosity to do a little bit more research, to think about ways you can apply some of these principles that Mark is talking about. So I'm going to start off with just briefly going over, for those that may not have been with us last week, kind of what the structure of the book is and the way it lays its arguments out. And then from there, I'm going to ask some what I call brain pan stirring questions to open us up with. And again, just, we don't need dissertations, just think about the question, what comes into your mind, in one or two sentences, what do you think about that question? After we ask those, we'll go into the video, which is about 7 minutes long, a little over 7 minutes. And then after that, we will go through a presentation of what these axioms are in this particular chapter, and then deep dive into some questions from there, look at scripture, and then I'll end by pointing out what Mark believes are 3 constructive things that we can do as we approach this very contentious subject of racism in our country. So far so good? All right, good. This is so weird for me. I'm used to standing at a lectern in front of a lot of people. So you're all gonna have to nod very profusely when you agree with me. So I see what's going on. All right, so what is the book all about? So if any of you weren't with us last week, Mark's book basically constructs an ethic that he calls a politic of compassion. And within any ethic, there are usually certain virtues that drive that ethical argument. And so for Mark, he lays out 3 primary virtues that he hopes will be, curated in people's hearts as they follow this ethic in their lives. The first one is kinship, right? The idea of connecting with others and self-sacrifice. And that leads into kenosis, which again is the epitome of self-sacrifice and self-giving. And then finally, and this is my absolute favorite, and I think one of Mark's favorite words, delight, right? Finding joy in self-giving and connection, I think is a major virtue that is the fuel, if you will, to encourage the ethic in our lives. As this ethical argument is composed, this ethic of compassion, Mark uses what are called axioms in each chapter. Axiom is a word that comes from the Greek axioma. It literally simply means alike, kind of, like alike or evident. If you took geometry in high school, you might have heard the word axioms. Sometimes in geometry, axioms are called postulates. And if you ever had to do a dreaded geometric proof, what you did is you looked at axioms, which were self-evident true statements about real numbers, and you would pick axiom and postulates to kind of form your proof statement and validate the argument of that geometric proof. And in ethics and philosophy, it works much the same way. Ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, all of the greats, they laid out their arguments with axioms and postulates, the same way that they proved out mathematical truths in their time. Mark states that axioms construct logical arguments, and he says in the book that the objective of employing axioms, and this is really important, is to reclaim our shared values as a people of faith so that we can reorder our everyday conversations and renew our commitment to practicing a politics of compassion in a way that embodies grace, reason, humility, and universal concern. So that's kind of the organization of the argument and how it's formulated. Now, the aim of the book, using that politics of compassion, he lays out for you on page 8. About halfway down the page, as he points out that as we engage not just racism, but all of these issues in our social society that we're dealing with, he says, our guiding question throughout the book is what Scripture, Christian tradition, and our experience and understanding of God have anything to say about the divisive issues of our time. In this work of Christian ethics, we apply ultimate meaning to proximate concerns in order to inform how we might live more faithfully and responsibly in the world. And so I kind of wanted to point that out just to kind of say that you know, when you read books on ethics, they can seem very ideological, they can seem very kind of high level. But really the point of any ethical statement is to drive behavior. It is to drive behavior and to create positive change in the way that we live and approach this thing called life. So that's kind of what the book is all about. That's the approach that Mark takes as he forms these arguments. And I tend to think he does a really good job. And I'm not saying that just because he's my boss, but because I think he does a really good job at doing what he's aimed to do. So with that, let's just kind of stir our brain pans a little bit, right? First question: why do you think race can be such a divisive or contentious issue for Americans? Why do you think race can be such a divisive or contentious issue for Americans? And that wasn't rhetorical. You can raise your hand and answer. Okay.
Well,
Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
Part of it is, you know, the way that it's cultural upbringing and, you know, where you were brought up, the values that you were taught or weren't taught, and, you know, kind of what you learned from the society around you. Maybe as a child, it could start even at a young age. And the people that you're around even later can change your beliefs and your ideas.
Okay. Thank you, Belinda. That's a really good insight. Anybody else?
you
Yes,
mentioned
Tom.
kinship, and that is very difficult if you were raised in a community where there were no blacks.
Okay.
And there's two problems. One of them, you fear blacks. And often, as my experience was, the first experience I really had was blacks making zip guns in shop class that I had to attend. And they wanted to know if I wanted to rumble. I didn't want to rumble because that's a knife and gunfight. That didn't ease my. The other thing is the culture is different. I had a kid that I was mentoring that was black that came into our mentoring class, and usually I can get inside their heads pretty quick. I could not get inside this kid's head. His culture was very different, but a gentleman who came in to be a mentor was in graduate school, was black. So I traded this kid to him. Within 2 days, they were just like that. So it's hard to break. And that's why I think you got to solve those two problems.
All right. That's a good insight. Anybody else really quick? We'll take about one.
Yeah, Jerry, you were muted
Yeah, I'm
for a
sorry.
second.
Yeah, I
It's
hit the
okay.
wrong button.
It's all right. And also, Jerry, I don't think everybody's computer shows up with the raise hand function. So it's not easy for everyone to do that. Just please be aware of that.
Okay, Toby, I see you'd like to say it. And you're muted, so you're going to have to come off mute so we can hear you. There you go.
I think a lot of racism, at least from where I grew up in Arizona, racism is often based on economics. And we're always everyone's trying to better their own economic position. And it's very convenient to have a group below you that you know can't do as well as you. In Arizona, we weren't prejudiced against blacks. We were prejudiced against Mexicans. And so it didn't have anything really to do with race. It had to do with who threatened the economics.
Okay.
So that's a whole side of it, I think, gets left out.
All right. Those are all really good answers. And we're going to talk about most of those things that y'all are bringing up. So the next question, when it comes to racism today, and this is just an either or question, you don't have to give me why you answered this way. Do you believe that it's a bigger problem, or do you believe that the bigger problem is discrimination built into our laws and institutions? Or is the bigger problem where discrimination is based on prejudice of individuals? where do you think the bigger problem lies? And you can be completely honest. Okay, this is a safe space. All right, like Steve said. So please don't try to mask or smokescreen your question to sound nice. Tell me what you really think.
Prejudice of individuals.
Okay, prejudice of individuals. Anybody else?
Yes, this is Bob Alexander. I think they go hand in hand, actually. I think
Okay.
it's the based on individuals, and then they bake it into the laws, you know. And
This is Karen, so we're here together. And you said they bake it into the laws. I think you have to look at who, from a racial perspective, who was putting the laws together. Were they white males? Were they
exactly.
A diverse law? I think when you pull that onion all the way back and you really look, you know, some of these laws were in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and there wasn't a lot of diversity I don't think, not from what I've read, a lot of diversity that came together to put those laws into place.
And if I could, I'd like to step back just because of my background on that first question. I think twist on it or answer to that. And I think that prejudice is based on a lot of people not being comfortable around people that are not like themselves. And I answered that way because I was a professional musician for a lot of years in my early 20s. And I played and I was around LGBTQ for a lot of years in my life, especially young. And I got comfortable with lesbian, gay, homosexual. I mean, they were some of my best friends, but just because they were gay or homosexual didn't mob. You know, I learned to be more comfortable because I was around people not like myself. You know what I mean? And I think that's true with when we talk racism. You know, that's my opinion.
Yeah, and that's a good observation. I mean, I think that goes back to Tom's point, right? You know, Tom was like, sometimes our lack of exposure to a given culture of people it causes discomfort whenever we come into it. You know, I can tell you that the first time, well, the only time that I went over to Palestine and spent some time in the West Bank, and I was over there for almost a month. A lot of the norms and the way that people behaved were very unnerving for me. For example, when you're in America, everybody, if you go to a food place and there's a line, everybody makes a nice single file line, because that's just how we do things in the West. We make a nice single file line. Well, in the Arab world, it doesn't work that way. In the Arab world, if there's a space open, you go to it. And so you literally just, it's crowds of people, you know, bunching into one another. And even that very simple kind of cultural thing, it took a lot of getting used to. Like, you know, what I felt like was rude behavior was really just the way that they behaved. You know, it was just a cultural thing. So yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up.
Along with what he said, I think, this is Karen, I think it also is, as individuals, how comfortable are we wanting to get to know and really understand and learn about somebody who's different than we are. Some people are comfortable with that. Some people not comfortable at all. I don't want to deal with people that aren't like me. But I think if you, in college, I traveled and studied in Europe for 6 months. So you get to learn other cultures, but you have to have that spirit of adventure to find out what's unique and what's different and so on and so forth.
Right. Laura, I think I saw your hand up. Let's take one more from Laura and then we'll kind of move on.
Hi, everyone. I think in combination with all of this, I think part of it is the comfortability level that we have with others is sometimes supported by institutions, laws, and discriminatory policies that allow us to feel discomfort with people that are other than us. And so I do think that it works both ways, and it works the other way, from what has already been expressed as well, that a lot of times we can glean support from those higher places that do things, say things, promote things, or not. And so I think that that's just kind of the other side of it going hand in hand, and that can allow us to feel okay in some ways with feeling uncomfortable because we don't have to, because they're this or this or this or this that society has told us, and that those things may not be true. So
Yeah, and that is a fabulous insight, and we're going to touch on that. That's going to be something very specifically that we touch on, because that's actually related to one of the very important axioms that Mark points out in this book, right? This idea of, construction and social construction, and how those tend to dictate and define our behavior for us without us even being aware of it. So these are all great answers. Thank you. For the sake of time, I do want to move on. So keep these questions in the back of your head. I asked them for a reason, right? As you watch the video, and let's hear for a minute from Rev Mark and see what he has to say about this chapter on racism. So Steve, if you could.
Okay.
Myself, give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt, give me doubt.
In West Bengal, the tourists flock to see what, at first glance, appears to be an expansive forest, branches creating a sprawling canopy over a botanical garden about the size of a Manhattan city block. But what looks to most like a forest of individual trees is actually one massive tree with 3,600 aerial roots. It's known as the Great Banyan Tree. Banyan trees are found all over the world. The largest grows in a botanical garden near Calcutta. It occupies 5 acres and is more than 250 years old. How does a single tree grow to cover a space of 5 acres with branches 80 feet tall over a period of 2.5 centuries? Banyan trees belong to the fig tree genus. They're pollinated by the species of tiny wasps that breed inside the fruit of their partner trees. Banyans are otherwise known as strangler figs, meaning they grow from seeds that fall from their fruit and land on and then germinate in other trees. Over time, that seed grows as a vine, dependent on the host tree for support. Eventually, it strangles its host tree, subsuming its structure. Its roots then grow from outward extending branches until they reach the ground, becoming trunk-like and expanding the footprint of the tree. When we think about systemic racism and the injustices experienced by people of color that grow unchecked over centuries, maybe we can call to mind the insidious tactics of the banyan tree, planting its seeds in neighboring hosts, then quietly germinating, growing, and eventually subsuming the whole structure of every willing host around it. Racism and its ideology of white supremacy is like the banyan tree, dropping its seeds into every institution, subsuming the very structure of those institutions. Perhaps this explains how it's even possible that black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than are white men. That blacks are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. That the median black family has only 10.2% of the wealth of the median white family. That blacks are 2.5 times as likely to be in poverty as whites. That the typical black worker makes 82.5 cents on every dollar earned by the typical white worker. It's time to work on ourselves so that we do not become like the banyan tree, dropping the seeds of racism into all the relational and societal structures around us, enabling racism to grow for generations to come. How can we work together to stop the spread of the one virus that has plagued our country for 4 centuries? First, those of us who are white have to do everything we can to learn what we don't know before we act and do harm because of what we don't know. Well-meaning white people often want to leap into action to solve the problem of racism, to march, to protest, to speak out, to demand change. Before white people try to save the world, we have to remember that racism is a problem that white people created, that white people have, and that white people need to fix. So slow down. Listen to people of color about their experiences of racism. Reflect on what you hear. Come to see that you do not stand outside of the problem, but are very much implicated in it. Second, don't ask people of color to teach you what you don't know. Instead, talk to others about what you don't understand about racism and what you still need to learn. All of us have unconscious biases that, when made conscious through our thoughts and actions, lead to feelings of guilt and defensiveness. But when we work past the guilt and we grow from it, we transcend the anxiety about being perceived as a racist. Just because we have black friends doesn't exempt us from personal responsibility. Failing to do the hard work of confronting our unconscious biases only allows racism to persist, just like that banyan tree dropping seed after seed for generations to come. Third, our ultimate goal isn't to be not a racist, but to become an anti-racist. That is, to commit ourselves to the hard work of dismantling racism. There's no neutrality in the racism struggle. Silence is complicity. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. And simply put, an anti-racist is an ally in the struggle to eradicate racism. We have to be honest about how whites benefit from systems that don't favor people of color. Then we use our own privilege to advocate for change and to advocate for those who work for change. If we can begin there, do you think we can find enough common ground to work together for the common good?
Give me doubt so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, I shall not fear.
Thank you, Steve. So kind of to go back to these questions that I ask you. I mean, look, it doesn't take much from me to make you all aware of the fact that racism is here, and that this fallacy that we live in a post-racist world is just that. It's a fallacy. I think now more than ever, with everything that we're seeing, with everything that we're hearing, with the outrage that is taking place on our streets in this country, what we're seeing is we're becoming aware that systemic racism, that the systems themselves are actually laying the foundation and have been for a really long time. And the hard part about that for us white folks, to be completely blunt, is that while we may, as Mark points out, have flashes of indignation when we see something racist happen, those flashes of indignation usually disappear just as quickly as they appeared, because we're part of a system that we benefit from, that we created. And it's kind of like a fish being in water, right? That's the old philosophical question that they ask us in philosophy, right? Does a fish know that it's wet? Right? It doesn't know it's wet till you take it out of the water and it's not wet anymore. And so that's the kind of thing that makes conversations about race both contentious, as Mark points out, and delicate. And so the real thing that we want to try to drive at, the questions that we have to ask ourselves as we approach this topic is how can we talk about race and lay things like defensiveness, reflexivity, scapegoating, and all that stuff aside so that we don't get trapped in deconstructive conversations. And as Mark pointed out, is it possible, is it even possible to talk about race with such honesty and daring that we might ourselves be implicated, awakened, if you will, and transformed? Now, I want to say from the outset that I share Mark's honesty when I say that as a white, heterosexual, 52-year-old male with a privileged upbringing, that there are parts of this argument that I really can't articulate. And there are parts of it that I can't understand. And I think that's the first step to really owning the problem and trying to work through it collectively. And I think that what Mark points out is that, you know, we have to be aware of our experience and how we're implicated in it. We have limitations as white people. So I love the way that he approaches the first axiom, right? So the first axiom that he points out in the book is that how we think about racism is largely determined by our own particular race. And if you remember, there were two great stories that he talked about in the book, right? One was a white woman, a professional, who found herself stranded in a parking garage late at night, only to be approached by a black man who was simply approaching the car to try to help her out. But as he approached, she felt real fear and like frightening, like real fear that something awful was about to happen. And the black man, almost sensing this, told her, I thought that you don't even have to get out of your car. You know, just pop the hood and I'll help you. He almost instinctively knew what her reaction to him would be, right? So that's one way. The other way is he talks about Camus, who again is a professional African-American man. And he runs through this scenario where Camus gets pulled over by a police officer and points out that, you know, that as a black man in today's society, getting pulled over by a police officer is probably the most single terrifying moment of a black man's life in this country. And he walked through the experience that he faced. And he does all this to point out the differences in how racism is experienced between these two individuals simply because of the color of their skin. The white lady experienced the racism as something personal. It was her personal prejudices that came to mind. Camus, on the other hand, experienced not as anything that he did, but as a person living inside of a system that was working against him. Some of you pointed out earlier, right, that part of the problem that we have when addressing these problems have to do with economics, right? That we live inside systems that maybe purposefully keep people in certain economic strata, and we like it that way because we want more and they've got enough, right? And so it's experienced from the point of where we come from. Really early on, if you don't know, Thomas Aquinas was a wonderful theologian, a very practical person. And Mark points out that Aquinas once wrote that whatever is received according to the manner of the giver. And Aquinas did this on several levels. You know, he pointed out really that even with God, that we experience God not as God is, because that's almost impossible, but as we are, that's how we experience things. And taking this same kind of axiom and pointing it towards race, Mark points out that what this means for us is that as white people, we have to become very aware of the fact that we experience racism much differently than our African-American siblings do. And we have to own that, right? He says that we have a moral responsibility to open our eyes and to see a society more truthfully and to become more receptive to what it is like to be Black in the United States of America. And he's got several statistics that he pointed out in the video. And again, the question that I hope it spurs in your mind, right? As you read all these statistics, and this is why I asked the question, is it individual or is it systemic? What's more important, right? Where's the real problem? Are all of these statistics and are all of these facts and figures driven by individual prejudice? Or are they driven by a system that is built on those prejudices with the aim of subjugating a certain type of person, right? Where's the bigger problem? The second axiom is one that we're going to dive into a little bit later. And it's a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? And Ta-Nehisi states that race is the child of racism, not the father. And really simply, I'm going to get into this later on, right? We're going to talk about this later on. What that statement basically means, and I'm going to throw this concept at you, and I hope that you just all go like this when I say it, right? But I'm going to throw out and submit to you that there really is no such thing as race. There's no such thing as race. Race is a socially constructed term that we have used to rationalize the unequal practices against people of color. Because first the exploitation came, and then the category of race came. And there's a wonderful book that I could suggest to you. I might even teach a class on this later. I've got it right here. It's called The Sacred Canopy by a sociologist named Peter Berger. And Peter Berger talks about this from the point of view of religion, about how we construct norms in our society and how those norms are legitimized. And then once they're legitimized, like some of you have even pointed out, right? I think it was Tom that pointed out that one of the problems is not just lack of exposure, but our cultural upbringing, right? Somebody said that, right? It was our cultural upbringing. That's the problem. I've been raised to believe certain things about people of color, and you never question those things. And so I would submit to you that you might challenge yourself in saying, why do I think those things? Right? Like, who told me those things? And does that really make sense, right? Like, how many people have you engaged in the community of color where that was legitimized? And so that's kind of what that statement means. And then third, and probably one of the most important is that color blindness is a myth that binds us to the truth, or that blinds us to the truth about racism. And this thing with color blindness really came up, I think, in the 80s and the 90s. There was this kind of campaign to say, well, I don't see color. I mean, you hear people talk about this all the time, right? We're all human and I don't see color. Well, many anti-racists would tell you that that's just a total, you're just kidding yourself. Everybody sees color. Everybody does. I mean, I'm looking at all of you right now and you're all white. Okay, you're all white. I'm white, right? We all see color. And what color blindness does really is it's a scapegoat, is how Mark puts it. That color blindness is a scapegoat to kind of help us sidestep the problem and avoid it and make ourselves feel better about ourselves. So with all of that in mind, let me just pause for a minute and see if there are any questions or comments before I ask a couple of pointed questions around this issue. So far, so good, by the way? Everybody right?
Oh, yes.
So good? Okay, good. Yes, Carol.
Jerry, oh, yes, I wanted to say that I'm not white, it's
No,
just
I didn't see you. You're right. You're not white.
See, with people of color, we're not even seen.
I just proved my own point, didn't I? I'm so sorry.
I said, well, my gosh, this light is really...
I'm going to blame it on Zoom, Carol. You were off the screen until you started talking.
Okay,
So
all righty. Okay, very good then. Because I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to, pass or something like that. But no, anyway, go ahead.
That's very good. I love you for that too. That was awesome. Any questions or comments?
I have a question for you. And from your point of view, the difference between, really prejudice and racism, especially, do you think, is there any scientific evidence? I mean, did racism exist before the Age of Enlightenment? Did racism occur in the 17th and 18th century on? Is this a modern day phenomena, or what the Jews went through and early in years ago, was that racism or was that prejudice? Was when was this birth? When did it was a birth? Born racism? Was it always forever, or do you think it's a more modern day phenomenon?
No, I don't. I mean, and this is just Jerry's point of view. I mean, I certainly don't think it's a modern day thing. I think the way that it starts is, the very fundamental of racism is that we pick a group of people and we decide for whatever reason that that group of people is less than, that they're not as good as. And then what we do is, usually you can look in ancient times when people were enslaved. Well, in order to enslave people, you had to kind of assign them a certain stratus in society, right? And you had to keep them there. And so in order to keep them there, what happens is that society builds up all kinds of norms and kind of true statements of their own, and these things are legitimized by institutions. And then once they're legitimized by institutions and generations upon generations grow, then it just becomes a fact. That, for example, Black people are blank. You know what I mean? And because they're blank, they're not as good as, or they're less than us. And to me, that's the real problem that we have nowadays, right? This is what the book White Fragility is all about, right? The real problem isn't accepting a different culture that exists in the African American community. The real problem is thinking that it is not as good as the white culture. And you see this even in the church, right? Like, this is something I bring up to people in the church. We all want to be diverse, right? And we all think that we want more people of color in our pews. But, I'm not so sure that a lot of people of color would feel comfortable inside of the expression of worship that we have at St. Andrew, because that's not what they grew up with. And you know what? That's okay. Because to be completely honest, for about 4 years of my life, I went to a Black church because it was awesome. You know what I mean? The music was awesome. The energy was awesome. I loved the preaching style. I loved all of it. And so I think that's the problem, if that makes sense, Bob. I think it's always existed, right? And that's kind of what Berger points out in sociological circles, is that societies construct norms and they construct axioms and premises that are then legitimized in order to kind of keep the community cohesive and together. But then, once things fall apart, you have to kind of ask yourselves where those things came from and if they're constructive anymore. I hope that helps. Yes, Harvey.
To Bob's question about how long racism has been around, there is a New Testament story, and I think Mark deals with this later on in another chapter of the book. In the 7th or 8th chapter of the book of Acts, about a person who was a 4-dimensional outcast who becomes a Christian. He is riding along in a carriage when he meets Philip, I think, and is reading the book of Isaiah. And anyway, engages Philip in a conversation. This is a revolutionary, explosive story because he is a eunuch, that is, he is a sexual, quote unquote, misfit. He is a Gentile. He is a foreigner, and he's Black. He's Ethiopian. And the nuance in the story as I read it is that because of all those things, he is, as you said, Jerry, the other. He is a less than, and he is welcomed into the faith community.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. So yeah, Bob, I think that this idea of assigning value to certain people based on either physical characteristics or behavioral characteristics is nothing new. I think it's been around forever. But as Harvey points out, one of the radical things about Christianity in the first century was that it fought quite openly against those things. Within the Jewish world, one of my favorite stories in scripture is the story about the woman who was bleeding for 12 years. And then she just touched the hem of the garment of Christ and she was healed. And a lot of people like to focus on the miracle, but the real miracle of that story is that the healing reconciled her to the community and brought her back in. And really, as you read through Luke, I would submit to you that all of the miracles that Jesus performs have nothing to do with the miracle itself, and they have everything to do with reconciling people back into their status within the community. And you see this in Luke, and you see it through the book of Acts quite a lot. So I think that's the real work, right? Is we have to ask ourselves as white folks, and being part of the system that we've created, and seeing the effects of it, what are we going to do about it? Because I thought that Mark very, very eloquently pointed out that we have a lot to learn, and that the work is our work, and that we have to realize we've created these systems, and now we need to work to better them for everybody. Anybody else, real quick, before I ask another question? Yes, Ron.
What I'm kind of picking up here is, I think that we're talking about is it individuals that are causing the racism, or is it the laws that are causing the racism? And I think, to me, it's a closed loop system, that they kind of work together. They feed off of each other, really. Especially, you get the white people that are the majority, and they make the laws, and then then the laws work towards prejudice, and then white people continue to keep the ideas going.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. A good point. Yes, Steve.
Jerry, let me ask a question that's been brought up sometimes and is rather sensitive about this topic, and that is regarding churches, and that is, what is the church's role, or should it be, in this? Should the church be more political? Should we be out marching? Should we have signs in front of our churches that say Black Lives Matter? How are we to figure our role in how to be activist on this issue and others, immigration, the others discussed in this book?
I don't know. What do y'all think? I'm going to be a good rabbi. What do y'all think?
This is kind of a spin-off question from the issues here, but it does keep coming up.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, seriously, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
I'm not that intimidating, am I? Go get
Hey, Jerry.
Yes.
This is Ron.
Yeah.
I think that since the church doesn't all necessarily, the people don't all believe the same way, we should probably do more as individuals as opposed to as a church, so that we aren't just representing a friend who in the church believes differently than we do. Okay. So it'd be real hard, I think, to put up signs, at least from my perspective, that gave one opinion.
Okay.
Isn't
Janet? I'm sorry, I saw Janet's hand real quick.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would say you have to get the white community and the Black community together and actually talk to figure out how we can help with this, because otherwise we're just trying to come up with something that might not help at all. You actually need to, that's right, earlier on we were talking about, I said, well, what about having a sister church that we could meet with, when that time comes where we can meet again, but and just get to know each other a little bit and open up the dialogue, I guess.
It's a good point. Very good.
To Steve's question, we Methodists do have quite a rich history of not being silent as a church on social justice issues. John Wesley in the late 1700s was publicly opposed to slavery. That was a controversial thing. In the 1840s, we have a huge division in Methodism between Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South. We split as a denomination over slavery. And it was a highly emotional, controversial thing. And it wasn't a group of individuals. I mean, it wasn't person by person who took that stand. It was us as a group, as a denomination. In the early 1900s, the Methodist Church was against child labor. And that was in our first statement of the social principles statement. And Methodists took a stand for women being able to vote in the early 1900s. And in the civil rights movement, There were, I mean, Don Messer, former president of ILIF, and Kent Millard, who was an interim pastor after I retired, marched with Dr. Martin Luther King as Methodist clergy. We have in the social principles statement always stood for justice and equality and compassion, as Jerry has said, toward the other, the least and the last.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, Steve, I think that this is a complicated question. I don't think it's a black and white thing. You know, I mean, I think on one hand, as Harvey has pointed out, and really even as Mark has pointed out in the book, to be Christian is to be political. Christians, you're not all monastics, okay? You're not all sitting in caves somewhere, figuring out your religion on your own. And Wesley was very clear that whatever Christianity was, it was a religion of community, that it could not be done in isolation. And so if that's true, then by implication, the church is involved in the community where it serves. It has to be in order to function. So in that regard, yes, I do think that we have responsibilities. And, you know, and I would point out that in my mind, any real great ethical revival that has happened through church history has happened because of the church and because there were individuals in the church that stood out front and demanded change. You know, and a perfect example of this in all of our lifetimes, of course, is the civil rights movement that was led, not just by Martin Luther King, but, you know, even by Malcolm X in the East, that it was led from religion. At the same time, you know, I think that every church operates inside of its local context and its local community, and that it has to find very specific ways to, you know, create that change. And I think that's the beauty of Methodist organization, right? Is it, you know, we all operate in our context and can live out that truth in one way or another. So it's, I think probably in this topic, what I would add too is that, as Mark pointed out in the video, that the first step is to listen. You know what I mean? I think, Janet, you pointed this out earlier, you know, that we just want to jump in there and grab our picket signs and start marching for change, right? But we don't even know what we're marching for sometimes, right? Like we're just protesting for the sake of protesting because it's wrong. I think we need to listen to the community of color. I think we need to learn from them. And I think that we need to do things that are specific to our community and our gifts and our resources and our abilities as St. Andrew to help alleviate that situation. Because it's a big, big problem. Oh my goodness, there's so many things that need to be done. And I just want to make sure that, you know, we don't do the wrong things. So with all that, let's ask the second question.
Jerry, could I add just a couple of words?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Jan Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in the same way that we did develop we have become a reconciling church,
mm-hmm.
and that we developed a reconciling statement and made that very publicly known. And so the issue came up about developing a solidarity statement.
Mm-hmm.
And so my understanding is that after the staff and the people that are all at the church, after y'all read the book, White Fragility, then y'all did write a statement. I don't think it's exactly called a solidarity statement, that it's something that's very similar, and that is posted on our website.
Yeah.
And I did look that up and read it. It hasn't been real publicly made known to all of the congregation, but I think that that's a step forward, and that it is a statement that, you know, that our church is standing for. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that that's certainly, you know, something that we need to continue. And is that my understanding, that the church overall is going to be encouraged to read White Fragility at some point?
Yeah, I think in general, I mean, from what I understand, and, you know, from my perspective, I think White Fragility is a great start, right? But I think there are a lot of other books, like Takashi Coates' book, that are other great resources that
Sure.
we can go. And I think
Yeah.
too, Jan, that plays into this idea that we need to listen more. So
I
you know,
agree. Totally.
I think listening to people of color, whether it's through writing or through lectures or
Yep.
you know, anything, I think
Yep.
that's where it starts. So
I agree.
absolutely.
Totally.
You need a community. Is there a Black community in Douglas County?
You know, I'm new here, but I'm going to guess and say no.
It is. I don't think so either.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the challenge, Tom. I mean, to be very honest with all of you, and I think I can be, I hope I can be, as somebody that's new to Colorado and new to Douglas County, that was one of the very first things that I had to adjust to, is because where I came from in Dallas, I was heavily exposed to multiple cultures, Indian culture, Koreans, Chinese, African American. I mean, it was all over. And I lived very close to it. And in some communities I lived in, I was actually the minority. Like I can remember the house that we raised our girls in for almost 20 years. Most of that community around us were Asian Indian. And we were the minority in that community. So it was a culture shock for me. But no, Tom, I would say that that's something that we have to consider too, is our exposure to the African-American community and how we listen to people of color in general. So let me ask you this statement I made about color blindness. Do you agree that color blindness is kind of an obstacle to addressing systemic issues of racism in the US? Do you think that's a thing, or is that not a thing?
I do think it's, I think color blindness is a problem because I think it's more commonly just blindness rather than color blindness. I see color just like I see disability, which would not be surprising having been the mother of a son with a significant disability. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just a fact. That's the starting point. But if we don't even notice color, I'm not sure how we can be sensitive to the unique concerns of persons of color, or of persons with disabilities, or persons in any other marginalized state.
It's a good word. I like that. Yes, sir, Ron.
I think to me it's a tool of denial. It's be able to say, well, I'm not prejudiced because I don't see color, when we all have ingrained prejudices from our childhood, from our society, from everything else. I think it's just denial.
Good word. Anyone else?
Well, and I think you can learn. I mean, you need to notice the color, and you need to learn. The last school that I worked in, we had kids and staff from all over the world, and that's so rich, and you can learn so much about their experiences and their approach to life if you just open up. We have to be careful that we don't look at racism as just a black and white issue. There's many other races out there too that we need to pay attention to. And if you notice color, if you make a point to get to know people, and I didn't have to go out of my way because I just went to work every day and it was right there. But I opened up and I learned from as much as I could. And so that's, you just have to put yourself in a situation where you will have that opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're all hitting it on the head. I mean, I'm trying to think about how I want to frame this, but for me, saying colorblindness is a lot like what I think you said, Ron. It's kind of a scapegoat in a lot of ways. It denies us the ability to really confront the problem that stands before us, right? And you know, what I would submit for all of you is what I learned at SMU when I was in seminary, is that at SMU, we really didn't talk about race so much as we talked about cultural diversity. And what that did for us is it allowed us to learn how to appreciate cultures on their own terms. And so, you know, the trick was not trying to make everybody the same, but appreciating the differences in everyone and learning from everyone. For example, you know, my Indian friends, I spent probably about 8 to 10 weeks visiting a Hindu temple and talking to their clerics. And I even attended a couple of their services. And I did the same thing with some of my Buddhist friends and some of my Islamic friends. Every year I was invited to a breaking of the fast during Ramadan. And I sat with them through the night as we ate a meal together. And, you know, it wasn't that I wasn't seeing color, but what I was trying to do was to appreciate the cultural differences between us and to accept that on its own terms and to really try to understand and learn from them. And I think when we say, you know, we're colorblind, what we really mean by that is, oh, well, why can't we just all be the same? You know what I mean? I mean, we're all the same, right? But we're not the same. And whether we want to admit it or not, we all have biases and internal biases that we don't know about and we're not aware of. And those biases tend to tell us that one thing is better than the other, that this is better, right? White is right, whatever. And you know, and we do that almost automatically. So I think if we can learn to kind of get out of that colorblind language and move forward. So with that, I do want to read a scripture for you real quick and just ask a couple quick questions. I know we're at the top of the hour. But Mark points to Genesis, the first iteration of the creation story, in Genesis 1, 26 through 27. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. I think Mark used the CEB in his book, so it might be a little different. It starts by saying, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. So hearing that verse, let me ask you, how does the image of God, as you heard in these verses, reflect the fullness and diversity of race or skin color as you look upon the world? When you think of the image of God, God created them in his image. How does that image, how does it reflect the fullness and diversity of God's created world and humankind?
He saw himself in different colors. I don't know.
It just sounds like inclusive language.
In what way?
Well, I mean, he uses, it sounded like, you know, kind of like a them statement where it's all, it's not just one or anything in particular. It's all encompassing.
But the real images we often see first are the images of ourselves, it seems to me. And why do all artists or many artists paint Jesus in the image of themselves, their own color, their own culture? And unless we work against that, that's the first image we see that God has created, because that's what we know.
So do y'all think there's any problem with, you know, having multiple images and likenesses of God or Jesus in various skin tones and colors and likenesses?
No, it certainly is helpful, but
why? See, this is the question, right? So why is that helpful? What's helpful about that?
Ice cream. And they're all ice cream.
I'm sorry, Tom?
There's chocolate and vanilla ice cream. And they're both ice cream.
That's right.
You know, I think about this question sometimes. I do, and this isn't colored blindness, but like others are maybe trying to say, I think of God as a white male like myself, right? But interestingly enough, fighting the things that I fought with my own health, and even from my wife's standpoint, the different things I've gone through in my life, I really try, and I'm not colorblind, you know, I'm not like that, but I really try to see God as not white and not black. I find myself really trying to go down that road, you know, and it's tough, but, you know, because like everybody, I like to be around people like myself, you know what I mean? I like to be around runners and musicians and, you know, playing the symphonies, I like to be around, you know, like, I know that probably wrong. So I'm trying to see God as non-denominational, you know, white, non-black, you know, just a force, maybe like Star Wars, that's out there, that's helping us, you know, or that we could tie into. But it's anyway, it's a struggle to try to get out of that stereotype, I think.
Yeah. Yes, Ron.
I see the image of God as compassion and love. And I think God created every human being with compassion and love, regardless of skin color or anything else. And I think that's really what separates us from the animals in many ways.
Okay.
Well, and if we think that God just created one kind, he didn't create one kind of tree or one kind of animal, or, you know, we can't limit God to thinking that he just created one race that's better than the rest. And he said, and he looked at it and it's all good, you know. We can't we can't box God in like that.
Yeah. And that's a good word, right? And I think you know, this question, what all of you are saying, right, is listen to yourselves, right? God created a bunch of different kinds of trees. Diversity is good. It expresses the fullness of creation. Ron said, you know, when it comes right down to it, compassion is the answer, right? And everybody can express compassion if they want to. Listen to these statements that you're making, right? And then go back in and start thinking and laying those over this problem of systemic racism and us and them. And start asking yourself, you know, how does this fit, right? How does it go against what I'm saying to myself, right? And then, you know, what's perpetuating that? And then what can I do to stop that perpetuation of that idea, you know, and where can I go with it? So here's the question that I'll finally ask, and I know we're getting really close here. But I do kind of want to feel your opinion on this, because I think this was kind of a hard statement for a lot of folks in the book to grasp a hold of. At least I get that feeling. Do you agree that race is a social concept rather than a scientific or biblical one? Do you think that that's a true statement, that race, like when I say black, white, whatever, do you think that that's a scientific thing, or is that a social concept?
Social.
I'm sorry?
I'd say social.
Social? Why would you say social?
Because it takes a group of like persons to develop it, to feel superior over someone else or another group. I don't know.
It's definitely social, because we made laws that said that if you were a fourth black, you were black. Well, you look at the color of somebody's skin and then we classify them not at how they look, but how we have viewed their ancestry or how we have viewed them. I think it's totally a social construct.
Anybody else?
Not to quote Facebook.
But you will
on
anyway,
Facebook
right?
this week, I will, and it's actually Harvey who posted it, or one of them that posted it, was the frying pan with 2 eggs, a brown and a white egg. And then the next frying pan was them without the shell. And I think that goes to why this, I would say, social, because the inside of those eggs are the same. and that's the science, is it's going to be an egg. But on the outside is when we start making determinations on right, wrong, whatever.
Yeah.
That's very good.
That's a very, yes, Ron.
I think Tom as a physician could probably tell you this. If somebody needs a blood transfusion badly, they don't check and see if the blood came from a black person and give it to a black person and a white person to a white person. They can't tell the difference in blood because we're all the same.
That's true.
There's no science involved there. They could say, we can determine where this blood came from. I mean, maybe genetically they can, but in a situation like that,
You have more pigment in your skin, but that's all.
Right. And really, like what a scientist would tell you is that the differences in pigmentation and skin are really just the result of your geographic location on the equator, on the planet. Right. People that, their ancestors derived from climates that had more sun, their skin naturally got darker to compensate for that type of exposure, as opposed to people raised in climates where there was hardly any sun and they're very cold, and they're pale and blonde as a result of that. So I think you're all right? I mean, you're all saying these things. We're all agreeing with that, right? That this is a social thing. Now, what's amazing to me, though, is that this story about the young lady trapped in a garage late at night, right? And she attached certain behavioral traits on a human being because of the color of the skin, right? And she did it unconsciously. And I think that's what I want to challenge all of you to think about, right? Is that even me, I will tell you, even me, all right, I have these internal biases, and sometimes they shock me. Like they really do. Like I will see somebody wearing a particular garment, and I will make a moral and character judgment about that person, and I don't even know their name, right? I've never even talked to them in my life, but because they're wearing a particular garment, I will make a character judgment. And then I have to stop myself and saying, holy cow, I've got Reverend in front of my name. What am I doing? You know what I mean? Like I'm not even making an attempt. You know what I mean? I just happened automatically. And so that's what I want to challenge all of you to do, right? You're all agreeing and you're all saying, you're right, Jerry. I grew up being taught these things and I don't think they're right anymore. But monitor yourself, right? Think about it. Be aware of how you're feeling in certain environments. As some of you have said, what makes me uncomfortable about this situation? Why am I uncomfortable in this situation? And then just kind of start to work with that a little bit and be aware of that. And I think it will go a long way. So we're at 8:14. I want to end this discussion really quick, if y'all will allow me, with just kind of reviewing the 3 suggestions that Mark had. And if you remember, we were talking about those values, right? Do you remember them? One was kinship, one was kenosis, and the other one was delight, right? Well, these 3 suggestions that Mark has at the end of his book all reinforce those value statements. They're tangible things that we can do to create those virtues in our world. So the first one, he says, if you're white, listen to people, especially to people of color who are willing to share about their experiences, okay? And I think when you do that, that the listening develops a sense of what Mark is calling kinship, right? When you approach people of color and you say, I want to learn, I want to understand, and they're willing to share that with you, or you go read a book by Tenoshi Cates, you know what I mean? That creates the sense of kinship that Mark is talking about. The second thing that you can do is talk to others about what you don't understand about racism, and think about what you still need to learn, right? I'll share a personal story with you really quick. I had a very good Black friend at seminary. He lives in Chicago. His name is Hosea. Hosea is African-American and he is gay. And he is really fired up about this whole thing. And me and him and I, we just did not get along for about a year. But it was when I allowed myself to listen to Hosea, right? To put away my own feelings and to really engage him and say, Hosea, I don't understand. I'm having trouble. I want to learn from you. I'm going to put aside myself and I want you to guide me through this problem. Now we're the best of friends. And I connect with him almost every day on Facebook. He works at a Methodist church in downtown Chicago, and I've learned a lot from him. Doing that kind of thing is going to develop kenosis. When you give of yourself, when you just self-empty, which is what kenosis is, and allow yourself to be filled in with that kind of knowledge, you can acknowledge your own flaws and limitations and surrender to the knowledge of somebody else. I had a good manager at Nokia once tell me that nobody knows their blind spots. Nobody knows their blind spots. That's why you need feedback from your peers, because nobody knows their blind spots. The third and final thing he says is that where there's an opportunity for relationships with people of different races and cultures, enter into them as deeply as the other will permit, with humility, because in the end, it's not about right believing, because orthodoxy alone will not heal these divisions and wounds in our country. It's about, as Ron said, orthopraxis, our right loving, right? And that's going to promote, I promise you, a feeling of delight. At least it did in my life. So do enter into deeply these relationships as far as the other will let you. And I promise you, if you do, it will make a world of difference and make a difference in the world. So with that, we're at 8:17. I hope this was okay for everybody. Such a big group and a weird environment. Would anybody like to make any closing comments just really quick before we ask Steve to close us out in prayer?
I wanted to make sure everybody knew about when Dr. Karen Ware is doing her study, her Zoom for us, and it's on, and is Jill here? I don't know if Jill is here tonight. She knows more than I do, but it's on our bias and our and racism. And so she's going to guide us through several weeks. And I think it starts the 1st of October.
Yes, I think you're right.
In that, you can let one of us know. You can let Jill Hinton is the contact person. Mm-hmm. And that would be an awesome study for us to go through.
And I'm available for you too. Please lean on me as a resource. If you would like to, for further reading on this topic or just, anything at all, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm here to serve you and to serve St. Andrew. So please don't be bashful about reaching out if you want to. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I want to say thank you again for allowing me to share this moment with you. I hope it has been enriching and edifying and educational to some degree. And I'll ask Steve to close us out in prayer.
Good discussion, Jerry. Thank you so much. And I'll read the closing prayer that Mark has at the end of this chapter. God of heaven and earth, you created the human family in your image and endowed each person with dignity. Grant us your grace in eliminating the blight of racism from our hearts, our communities, and our social, civil, and religious institutions. Fill our hearts with love for you and for our neighbor as we work together to heal our land from racial injustice. Amen. Thank you, everybody. Good discussion. Please join us next week. Same time, same channel.
Different teacher.
Different teacher. Probably be Rhonda Mazur next week, and Mark Feldmeyer says he will join us for some of the time. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.
Blessing y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Thank you.